everybody. Welcome to my house. We are starting our read along today on May 1st because this is the day that Jonathan Harker boards a train in Munich, Germany, heading to Vienna. The novel picks up with his first journal entry on May 3rd. So this episode is our introduction. I wanted to provide an overview, just a quick introduction to who I am, what the Rosenbach is, my experience leading up to the read along, and understanding the framework of the read along. So chapter by chapter, we'll have a plot overview as well as additional historic details, social context, or things that are frequently missed or misunderstood in the text of the novel. Initially, we're going to go one chapter a week, though that may change as things evolve over time and we see how quickly people are able to get through the material. There will also be a supplementary article every Friday through Substack that is a deeper dive into one particular topic that we touched on in the video. So it's like a supplementary deeper dive into just one aspect that is briefly mentioned in the video. I'm kind of treating this whole experience like a beta test. We're going to have the chat. We're going to have the Friday articles through Substack. We're going to have the YouTube videos. And each one of those things is going to be something you can engage with to understand Dracula better. But it's a mix and match. You don't got to do them all. You can do as many or as few as you want. You can do them all or you can do one. There is no right or wrong way to proceed through the read along. It is one thing that was really important to me was finding different avenues to reach people in a way that works for them. It's actually something I find really interesting about commercial fiction. When people write literary fiction, they're thinking about writing from an artistic standpoint, and that's an expectation. But when people are writing commercial fiction, they think reading to entertain. There's no reason it can't be both. Commercial fiction, particularly horror, gives us an opportunity to really understand the fears and anxieties of a person or a society or a place. Or in the case of Dracula, it's really of a certain people in a certain time. Bram took a very interesting approach with the novel that I think is something we see echoed throughout many modern horror writers. Stephen King does this a lot, but he uses so many real places and situations and timing to help the reader feel grounded in the everyday reality where this incredibly fantastic story is taking place. Part of what I want to do in this read along is help you understand what it might have felt like for that Victorian reader to pick up a bright yellow book off of maybe the newsstand at the rail station as they're picking up their train to get to work one day, or going to visit family across the city. They see this bright yellow book with red lettering called Dracula in May of 1897, and what would that experience have been like for them? We're also going to be kind of moving through the book, at least in the beginning, in real time, because Jonathan Harker is boarding a train to Munich on May 1st, and the book picks up on May 3rd with his first journal entry. Some of the information that makes this book so interesting actually happens in places people may have skipped. Because when you read a book, do you always read every single page? Do you go through and actually notice every single page? Not usually. When we're doing a close reading, we do. But the first thing that is in most copies of Dracula is the dedication, which reads, "To my dear friend, Homie Beg." And I had to ask myself when I first read this, who or what is a Homie Beg? Homie Beg is a nickname for Bram Stoker's very, very, very intimate friend, Hall Caine. And I would just underline intimate here. Their level of closeness throughout their lifetimes cannot be understated. Hall Caine was the best-selling writer of the late Victorian era. He was like that generation's Stephen King. He was wildly, wildly, wildly popular. Homie Beg was an affectionate Manx nickname, meaning little Tommy, because Caine's given first name was Thomas. Manx is a specific dialect of the Gaelic language, a localized dialect to the Isle of Man. Hall Caine had a close association with Isle of Man. That's where he spent summers during his childhood. And the nickname was given from his grandmother. He actually hated the nickname, but it was kind of an inside joke between him and Bram that if the novel was going to be remembered, then people would remember what his nickname meant. That is a detail that is so frequently missed, but already gives you so much insight into who Bram Stoker was. Another factor that is frequently missed is this book actually starts before chapter 1. That's how we're going to go through this novel page by page. There's other context that's going to make this experience even more exciting and more entertaining and fun. That'll be through some of the other elements, but like I say, this is a choose your own adventure. You engage with what parts you want to engage with. If it's just the videos, you will end this read along with a very lovely overview, a deep, close reading of the novel. But if you want to play the game with me, let's pretend it's real. We'll go through page by page together, try to experience what it was like for that first Victorian reader. And that's why I'm so excited about this read along. We are starting on May 1st because May 1st is when Jonathan boards a train in Munich, Germany, and heads off to Vienna. From there, he will eventually continue on to Transylvania. If you want to go into the deeper levels, this is where you could read the short story Dracula's Guest. If you are interested in that, I am going to provide a link. You can find it for free on Project Gutenberg. It is part of an early draft of the first chapter that was eventually cut. So that is another thing to understanding the text that frequently people just miss or don't understand or never hear about. There is this other text. I would actually recommend, if you've never read Dracula before, to read Dracula first and then go back and read Dracula's Guest. If you are doing this on a reread, you take your pick. That is something that you can read before or after at any time, and we're going to have some supplementary information and videos about understanding and reading Dracula's Guest as part of this read-along. I'm calling it a read-along because I want us to actually read it and discuss it and experience it together. That's why it's not just a book club. The read-along is going to be closer to a close reading. A close reading is a technique that's used to understand a text on a deeper level, on a completely different level. Traditionally, in a close reading, you'll read the text 3 times. The idea is that at the end of it, you understand every single word and the context and meaning of every single word in that book, and you're making your best guesses as to how and why the author put it there in that order. It's the best way, the closest way that we can get to understanding what it was like to experience that book for the first time and to get inside the writer's mind just a little bit and maybe understand how and why they decided to write this book. We're going to move chapter by chapter, and each of these videos is going to contain a chapter overview, and we're going to pause throughout to discuss certain points that are either often missed or confused or lack cultural context the original Victorian reader would have had. When you start talking about writing as a profession, we are frequently advised to consider our ideal reader. Your ideal reader is going to be different from mine, is going to be different from someone else's. And in considering our ideal reader is how we're tailoring a reading experience to our audience. My opinion is that Bram Stoker wrote Dracula for Henry Irving. Henry Irving was his intended audience. The reason I say that is I was shocked to learn that in his lifetime, Bram Stoker was not known as a writer primarily. He was known as Sir Henry Irving's business manager and personal assistant. And then I said, cool, who is Henry Irving? I have no idea who he is. I am a theater kid, and I had no idea who he was. Henry Irving was one of the biggest celebrities of the late Victorian era in London. He was an actor. He focused on Shakespearean productions, and he was really well known for his villain roles. He was a very sociable person. He was out on the town. He loved to host. He became the owner-manager of the Lyceum Theater. Just before that happened, as he was kind of up and coming, he was on a tour and he was in a production, and that is where he read in the newspaper this review of his performance that was just absolutely glowing, written by a young man named Abraham Stoker. And Bram Stoker was born and raised in Dublin. He was a civil servant working in Dublin Castle as a clerk. He also loved the theater. He was really sick when he was a boy. He was bedridden until he was about 7 years old, then made a complete recovery. We don't know what illness he had, but we do know that he spent a lot of time in bed listening to his mother telling fairy tales and stories about living through a cholera epidemic. So he got kind of a very young education in some dark folklore and history that definitely impacted him as he grew up. He went to Trinity College. He was a big guy. He was very athletic for being basically completely bedridden until he was 7 years old. It's kind of shocking that he turned into this great big strong man. He won various athletic competitions and became well known as this really popular, gregarious, sociable, amiable guy. He also was a writer. He started writing short stories at a young age and keeping journals. He was a theater critic. He actually worked pro bono for the newspaper as a theater critic just because he was disappointed in the quality of the theatrical reviews of Dublin. So he was working for the newspaper for free. And that is how he came to see the production by Henry Irving. After he wrote up that article on Henry Irving's performance and the actor read it, he requested a meeting with Bram Stoker. And that is where he offered him a job and said, hey, come work for me. Come be my business manager at the Lyceum Theater in London. And Bram Stoker said yes. A lot of people hear the name Bram Stoker. Everyone knows Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. If you name a classic book and you ask what the author was, most people are probably not going to remember. Dracula is an exception. People remember Bram Stoker. But in his lifetime, he was not really known as a writer. He was known as Sir Henry Irving's business manager and personal assistant. Sir Henry Irving was one of the biggest celebrity actors of his time. He was a traditional Shakespearean actor, and he was really, really well known for his portrayal specifically of villains. One of the most well-known performances of his entire career was Shylock. We definitely see the inspiration of Irving throughout the novel, but my theory is that from the very beginning, Bram hoped that his novel would be adapted to the stage, that Henry Irving would take an interest in producing it and playing the titular role of Count Dracula. This is part of why people think that the book was inspired by Henry Irving, but I don't think that's true. I don't think it was so much inspired by Henry Irving as a human being as it was written with Henry Irving in mind to be the theatrical production of Bram Stoker's childhood dreams, basically. It was really common at the time in fiction to include references to other fiction, particularly Shakespeare, poetry, even popular poetry at the time. It was very common for people to read and know many poems and to be able to recite them, including lines from other works, and not even really necessarily calling them out is something that was very common at the time in Victorian literature. And Bram Stoker, you can see it throughout the text, but there are quite a few Shakespearean references. Many of them, you read it and you know he must have been thinking of how Henry Irving would experience that line. In many ways, I think that we write for ourselves, right? We write the fiction we want to see in the world, and frequently our ideal reader is someone who probably has similar tastes as us. I think that Bram would have imagined somebody similar to him. In many ways, Dracula is a frontier novel and an adventure novel. So people like him that were reading, they called them strange tales. That was, they kind of evolved to become the weird tales that we think of from a genre perspective, but could have been considered a techno thriller at release. So other people looking for entertainment and people in that same adult professional category, people like him. So he moved himself and his brand new wife, Florence, to London and worked for Henry Irving. And that was a position he held for 27 years. The Lyceum Theater had a restaurant attached to it called the Beefsteak Room. And this is where people would come and hang out before and after performances. And Bram Stoker was the ever-present host of the Beefsteak Room. While Henry Irving was a very demanding taskmaster, kept Bram busy around the clock, Bram really still viewed Henry with this almost like hero worship. And it gave Bram the opportunity to be close to the who's who of late Victorian society. So he became great friends with other writers, politicians, you name it. If you were anybody who was anybody, you were going to the Lyceum Theater. And if you were going to the Lyceum Theater and you were hanging out in the Beefsteak Room, you would know Bram Stoker, and he would kind of be the gatekeeper for Henry Irving. It's just really interesting to me what he was known for in his life is not at all even known for today. His New York Times obituary, his writing is barely a footnote, and they call it not of a memorable quality. Joke's on New York Times. I like to say that I'm a researcher. It's hard to argue with researcher, but the reality is that I feel like I kind of stumbled into this path. I happened to take a class on a whim at the Rosenbach on Dracula. I just happened to come across an advertisement for it, and the Rosenbach is an organization that I was already familiar familiar with. They're a rare book museum and library in Philadelphia. I had visited the Rosenbach a couple times and I saw that they were offering a class on Dracula and I decided to take it. I thought it would be a fun distraction. The class was incredible. I got so much out of it. The professor was amazing. I found myself becoming really curious. Through the course of the class, I found out the Rosenbach is the home of Bram Stoker's personal working notes for when he wrote Dracula. I am a book enthusiast and I had no idea this is something that existed. I'm a horror enthusiast and I had no idea that this is something that existed. It's over 100 pages of Bram Stoker's notes for creating the novel, including outlines, character sketches. I really think of them as a national treasure. The Rosenbach purchased the notes in February of 1970. The Rosenbach brothers were book collectors in Philadelphia and they donated their entire estate. They thought books belonged to everybody. They thought that knowledge should belong to everybody. They wanted to democratize the availability of this knowledge. So the Rosenbach organization still exists today as a place for people to enjoy the collection, and they continue to add to it. But one of the amazing things to me is that is how I learned that not only these incredible documents exist, but the path of being an individual independent researcher for fun or as a career is something that's actually way more accessible than people might think, because you don't have to be affiliated with a specific organization or a university to go to somewhere like the Rosenbach and conduct research. They keep their doors open to anyone with a desire to learn. And I think that's really incredible and is honestly part of what makes me so passionate about that organization and their mission. I have always loved horror. I've always loved Gothic horror specifically, and I've always wanted to write Gothic horror. So as I started taking my writing more seriously, I realized that the best way for me to improve my own writing would be to study the works of what we consider to be the masters and what's more classic than Dracula. I had been studying on my own independently for several years, and I decided to take this Dracula class on a whim, and I just absolutely fell in love with the content. I fell in love with the instructor and the passion that he taught the class with, and his obvious just adoration for this text and the literature. It just made it really immersive, and I found myself reading about it even outside of class, even things that were not going to be part of the discussion. I got it in my head that I wanted to go see the notes and research the notes myself. So I made my research appointment and they said, Bram Stoker's writing is really hard to decipher. We recommend that you have a copy of the facsimile of the notes so that you can understand what you're reading. Do you need us to provide you one? And I said, oh, no, of course not. I will be bringing my own facsimile. Thank you. Thank you. I, of course, did not own a facsimile of the notes. I didn't know that such a thing existed. But since the research appointment wasn't for several weeks, I went and purchased a copy. The facsimile is what it sounds like, a photocopy of every single page of Bram Stoker's notes, along with a transcription next to it and annotations from two of the world premier Dracula scholars at the time. So it is just an invaluable resource to understanding the development and creation of the novel, not really knowing what I was getting into, determined to not look like I had no idea what I was doing. I read through every single page of those notes through the facsimile copy in great detail over the course of about 3 weeks. Then I went and saw them in Philly and spent the day with them. It was just an experience that I can't describe. Even thinking about it gives me goosebumps, because the idea that you are holding in your hands this piece of literary history. I am holding a piece of paper that Bram Stoker held, that he wrote words on as he was puzzling through plot holes in Dracula. For my little bookworm heart, it does not get cooler than that. I just could not believe I had the incredible luck to live in a place where this is an opportunity that I can have, that I can just drive into town, go see Bram Stoker's notes in person and spend the day with them myself. I was so excited to talk about it that I started discussing it in my Substack. I'd been writing Dracula articles previously, but this is when it really took off. And I got so obsessed with it that I said, we're going to take a little break from some other projects. My original idea was, hey, I can talk about these things and it might be interesting for people to understand more about as an introduction to my own fiction. And that is still the intention. Come for the Dracula discussion, stay for my own Gothic fiction, hopefully someday. But in the meantime, I'm happy to provide this understanding of Dracula to a broader audience, because I think we need more ways for people to see how exciting and relevant literature is. My goal is to talk about Dracula. I love talking about Dracula. I could talk about Dracula all day long, every day, all day. I do, and nothing has made me happier. I get so excited to talk about Dracula with people. Anything that allows me to continue my Dracula discussions, I am happy. But the read along actually had never occurred to me. I had the idea after the visit at the Rosenbach to write a mini series about the technology of Dracula. It's such a theme in the book. I had kind of been brainstorming my potential subjects, and when I would ask people, they really seemed to have an interest in the technology. But the more I thought about it, the more that I thought to do it justice the way that I wanted to, it would need to be a mini series. So I said, okay, cool. I'll write a mini series about one topic. And initially I wasn't even sure how many installments it was going to be. I was thinking 3. It ended up being 6, and I could have kept going. But after the first installment, I planned it out for 6 essays. After the second essay, I realized it was taking off. It was just reaching a bigger and bigger audience, that for some reason, what I was writing was interesting to people. As it started taking off and more people started liking and commenting and sharing and mentioning to me through the discussions that they'd actually never read the book, that they'd always meant to, and they'd never read it, saying, hey, you know, I've always meant to read this and you inspired me to do it. After getting that comment a dozen times, I was like, wait, should we read this together? Let's just do that. Or people on the flip side who said, you know, I read this in my teens, or I read it in my 20s, or I read it and I didn't get it. I thought it was boring. Or I read it and I loved it, but then I read it again and I hated it. People wanting to revisit their experience with Dracula. So just after all of these conversations, I said, yeah, let's read it together. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought we can really make this fun. And then at the same time, I started, as part of my research, going through Sundays with Dracula, which is an amazing resource on YouTube from the Rosenbach. My professor, who I took the Dracula course with, Ed, is the host for Sundays with Dracula. And if you want more Dracula content in your life, that is the deepest level of YouTube conversation that you can have about Dracula. And I plan on including all of the links to easily access that information if that's something that folks want to get into. But my goal with it is to provide a similar experience to Sundays with Dracula, but more concise through some different research, a newer lens, because that was written and done during the pandemic. It was also done over the course of 27 weeks with 1 week for each chapter. We're planning on going through this close reading a bit quicker than that, though I do plan on looking at the pace by the community. I wanted to provide people with the close reading experience because of the enthusiasm that I saw being generated by the technology of Dracula essays, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to see if we could bring the text back to a broader audience. Another thing that came out of those conversations is the realization that so much of the information that's out there about Dracula, because it is such a pop culture phenomenon, has become apocryphal, something often repeated but not true. When something reaches the epic proportions in pop culture like Dracula, it turns out when you start trying to separate fact from fiction, it's really hard. It takes a lot of research and a lot of dedication. And I started realizing that most of everything that I thought I knew was wrong, that most of the things that get repeated are wrong, and that most of the things, even by other historians, sometimes are wrong because they're based on things that were done before Bram Stoker's notes and the typescript were widely known. So we made a lot of assumptions about Dracula before those documents that now we have a very different understanding of them. But the history hasn't caught up. The understanding of it hasn't caught up. And I want to help people understand the fact versus the fiction of Dracula. As soon as you understand Bram Stoker's notes in any way, shape, or form, you know Elizabeth Miller. Because Elizabeth Miller was one of the Dracula scholars who published the note. You will read all her annotations. She's probably written more about Dracula and about Bram Stoker than almost any other scholar. There are a few others, but as I started branching out my Dracula studies, I made it a goal to read everything by Elizabeth Miller, because if I'm going to separate the fact from the fiction in Dracula Sense and Nonsense, what I would consider is like her attempt at saying, here's the fact from the fiction in Dracula, that information has not reached a broad audience. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't been continually updated anymore because Elizabeth Miller passed away. In fact, several of the world's most prominent Dracula scholars passed away recently. And that is one of the things that I uncovered through my Dracula research. And I said, hey, wait a minute, but then who's doing it today? And when I went to the Rosenbach and I asked the librarian that question, she kind of smiled at me and said, well, they didn't really appoint like successors for those kinds of things. Whoever decides to take up the mantle is whoever decides to take up the mantle. I was thinking when I asked the question that I could find some amazing scholar that I could learn from and that I could maybe apprentice to. And she kind of smiled at that too. Now I understand it is something where you pave your own way. There are plenty of people in the community that want to help you, but this is just where I am. I want to understand what the fact from the fiction is so I can continue Elizabeth Miller's work. I feel called to take up the work there is still to uncover and learn.